You know, of all the things I talked about today, I didn't get around to talking about the sleight of hand exhibited in this movie that went from pickpocketing to almost parlor magic, which was impressive for me because magicians everywhere can rejoice at this and no longer have to live in shame the way that they've been living ever since Arrested Development so maliciously maligned the art of magic as being taken seriously. Mission Impossible elevates the craft for all of us, and maybe no one will change their mind on this, but either way, I saw a few good moves. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, today, I'm very happy to have with me writer-director Christopher McQuarrie in the podcast for his latest film, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. It's always great to talk with Chris about his latest film, and today was no different. Now, folks, right about here is usually where I do a plug for Backstory Magazine and our new issue, but we are in pause mode during the WGA strike, and just yesterday, SAG-AFTRA joined the WGA writers on the picket line. There's a SAG-AFTRA strike as well, and so while I hope you continue to support independent journalism, the act of interviewing screenwriters and actors, which is something that Backstory Magazine and this podcast does, it'll continue to get tricky for a while. There's ways to do it according to the strike rules, which I will be doing some of for sure. But I just want to thank all the readers of Backstory Magazine over the past decade and our podcast listeners as well for being patient with us. And I want Backstory readers to know that issue 49, our latest issue, yes, it has an Oscar cover, but our May issue, which was going to be Emmy stuff, was delayed because of the starting of the strike. We are updating new articles inside of issue 49, which is something cool that we could do as a digital magazine. And then once the strike is over, we will come out with an issue 50. But that's the good news of being a digital magazine. You could always add updates. And you could also enjoy our archive, which has previous issues, including interviews with Christopher McQuarrie. So win-win. But look, Backstory Magazine and the Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast both support the WGA and SAG-AFTRA in their pursuit of better working conditions and better pay for their members. And we will adhere to all guidelines regarding interviews issued by the guilds. So that brings us to today. Christopher McQuarrie, he's a hybrid. He's a writer-director, and the DGA is not on strike. And so today I picked neutral ground of storytelling and some directing stuff, as well as a few things in the movie that were cool moments. And I was pleased to have Chris back on the podcast. And we've already talked about the possibility of doing a longer episode to look deeper into the film. So that might be coming into your feed in the future as well. But look, I was highly entertained by Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1, and I know you will be too, and I look forward to seeing Part 2, and Chris was very forthcoming about his creative process and what it took to get this film made, so I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you share some love with our two sponsors, Screencraft and Final Draft. Firstly, Screencraft wants all WGA writers and SAG-AFTRA actors to know that they support both guilds in their historic strike for better working conditions and for fair pay. Firstly, Screencraft wants all WGA writers and SAG-AFTRA actors to know that they support both guilds in their historic strike for better working conditions and fair pay. And of course, Screencraft is following all guild rules. Now, when it comes to breaking into Hollywood as an aspiring writer, it can be confusing and a convoluted business. Fortunately, Screencraft helps writers with both the craft of writing and the business of Hollywood. Screencraft.org has everything for your writing journey, from video lectures with your favorite writers like Tony Gilroy and J.J. Abrams to hands-on career coaching with their writer development team. Screencraft also has some of the best genre-specific screenwriting competitions featuring judges that include Oscar-winning screenwriters to top literary reps. Hundreds of past winners and finalists have started their career with the direct support of Screencraft and have been connected to companies like Zero Gravity, Bellevue, APA, WME, and A24, and staffed on shows like The Flash, Woke, All Rise, Good Trouble, and more. So if you're an aspiring writer, don't wait to check out Screencraft over at screencraft.org. But before you enter a contest, you need to write your script first, and Final Draft is the software to do it with. But first, Final Draft has provided us with a statement about the strike, which reads as follows. Final Draft stands in solidarity with the Writers Guild of America because it all starts with the script. And of course, Final Draft also stands behind the talented members of SAG-AFTRA who are equally pursuing better work practices for when they breathe so much life into the scripts they perform. Final Draft proudly supports the rights of writers and actors and both the WGA's and SAG-AFTRA's pursuit of fair compensation for their work. Now, folks, Final Draft is the industry standard screenwriting software used by 95% of the film and television community, along with screenwriting pros like Aaron Sorkin, Guillermo del Toro, James Cameron, and Sofia Coppola, plus today's guest, Christopher McQuarrie. In fact, Final Draft told me that McQuarrie once said about the software, and I quote, "Final Draft is what allows me to do a 6-week rewrite in 12 hours, but don't tell Disney." Final Draft makes formatting a screenplay easy so that you can focus on what you do best, the writing. And folks, keep in mind now through August 31st, 2023, you could save 30% off an upgrade or new download of Final Draft 12 over at finaldraft.com, where you could use discount coupon code QAPOD23. That's QAPOD23. So head on over to finaldraft.com and learn more. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with writer-director Christopher McQuarrie about his latest film, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning, Part 1. Look, it's good to see you. I loved your film.
Good to see you.
Before we get to it, what would you say, looking back, was one of your bigger lessons for Mission Impossible Fallout, your last film?
I would say that there were so many things we took forward, but I would say the biggest one going forward was not to go into the story with any preconceived notion of what the movie was going to look like, but let the story define how the movie looked. I'm more comfortable now, where before I was trying to do something that was a stylistic departure from Rogue Nation in doing Fallout. By the time I got around to doing this, I realized that if I follow the story, everything will be a stylistic departure. I'm at a place now where I hope I never make any two movies that look or feel exactly the same. I'm not interested in having a style. What I think I'm after is a sweeping emotional vibe that used to be in movies, the movies of Michael Curtiz and John Ford, John Huston, even early Spielberg, early Lucas. They all went for a kind of unashamed, unabashed emotionality that I want to bring back. And for some people, that's corny, and for some people, that's clunky, and they don't like it, and I get it. But for me, that's the kind of movies I grew up on, it's the kind of movies I love, and I like movies that leave me with that feeling. And I was concerned going into this movie, as I was concerned when Top Gun was waiting to be released, whether or not there still was an audience for that kind of movie. And thus far, the numbers seem to be showing me that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it worked out great. You know, something that was kind of a new thing here as we're sitting here having this discussion in the middle of the WGA strike. Basically, the WGA has asked that I not do too many screenwriting questions, but something that is unavoidable, and we could talk craft about. You're credited with co-writer Eric Jenderson, and I'm just curious how that came about, because on the previous two movies, you know, there was somebody that had story credit. Drew Pearce, I guess, had story credit.
Yeah, Drew Pearce was involved in Rogue Nation really early on, and he had to leave. He had other commitments, and he had to depart. So he was there at the beginning, but before the story kind of evolved into what it did. And interestingly enough, when Drew Pearce was on board, the character that ultimately became Ilsa was very much a different character, similar to the character that Haley is playing in this movie. And in fact, we had Haley in mind for. And so Eric is somebody that I've worked with a bunch of times. He and I met at the Sundance Writers Lab. Oh God, it has to be 18 years ago, maybe longer, maybe 20 years ago. And he had a script about the life of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, which he had been trying to get made. And he and I hit it off, and he wanted me to direct it. I said, at that stage in my career, I said, I'm the last guy you want to attach as the director to your movie. I'm never going to get it made. And 20 years later, I still haven't. But in that time, we've developed a bunch of things together. Anything that I'm working on, he's a sounding board for me. Anything he's working on, I'm a sounding board for him. He was very much a ear to bend during Rogue Nation and Fallout, and it seemed only a natural progression here. And his involvement became deeper and deeper as we went. He really only started writing on Part 2, and so that was where it was going to begin and end. And by the time I had reached the end of Part 1, it was really hard to discern where things began and ended in terms of what constitutes writing. And there are specific ideas in part one that were absolutely and indisputably Eric's ideas. And so finally I just said, here's the deal. And so he's got credit on both. I absolutely could not have done it without him. And the big part, the real big contribution that is undeniably Eric is anything nautical, all things submarines and all that. That's all his research. That's all his area of expertise. Eric is a seaman in his own right. He lives on a boat. That's kind of his area. And where he really comes into his own is in part two. There's a fascinating arc in part two that's completely the brainchild of Eric Jennerson.
I'm excited to see it. When a writer faces a blank page, there's many ways to start a film, start a script, and you started in a submarine. And I just want you to give us some insight into what led you down the path towards starting the film the way you do in a submarine, as it is very distinctive, and I think it worked quite well. What can you tell us?
What I can say is that the submarine sequence was extremely contentious. It was very difficult for people outside of the movie to see the purpose of the submarine in part one. And Tom and I very much stuck to our guns, saying, no, you need a real world demonstration of what this thing can do. Without this, the entity is an abstraction. It's an intellectual idea. And even if the audience doesn't fully understand what they're seeing in the beginning of that movie, by the end of the movie, they're realizing it. The second time you watch the movie, you're feeling it very much. What I'm really pleased with in this movie, in the press that I'm reading on the movie, even the people who don't like the movie, are able to follow very complicated ideas that are laid out in the movie that are not visualized. There are a lot of them are things that are pictures we're putting in your head through dialogue and exposition and things like that. People are grasping the concept of what this is, which they probably wouldn't have done even a couple of years earlier. It was the notion of information technology as a threat was a very intellectual idea. And so that's why the submarine was so important to us. But of course, that was very challenging because that meant when we built the submarine and how we built the submarine and how much of the submarine had to then stay in existence for the second part of the movie over such a long period of time. It's an extremely, extremely challenging logistical and engineering nightmare that, frankly, people were very reticent to confront. And well, we're very grateful that they finally confronted it. It was a big deal. It was a big deal because the notion of sets like that have to carry over the course of two movies. Normally, you would build a set like that, you would break that set down, and that would be the end of it. It's not something that you would build and store for years, plural. It's a very long game. It's a huge future projection, which is just filled with uncertainties, and it's very, very scary. And we just kept assuring the studio that this was the right thing to do, that the submarine sequence was going to work. And we showed them an early cut of the submarine sequence, which was much longer and had no sound. It was completely silent. And when they came out to the UK and they watched the submarine sequence, they totally got it. They understood what it was. Look, it's very hard. When you're reading it on the page, it's an extremely technical thing. It's a lot of submarine jargon. It's all a lot of technical crap. I love submarines for that very reason. They speak a foreign language even when they're speaking English.
Yeah.
It's a lot of cool tech jargon. I know they know what it means even if I don't. So it was very difficult for them to feel the emotionality of what the scene was. And what's most important about that sequence are the faces of the sailors in it. All of those seamen are very specifically chosen for one very specific reason. They all have great sympathetic faces, and the way that the entire scene is framed and shot. No one's ever alone in the frame. No one's ever isolated. You have about 3 minutes of screen time in which to create a culture and build a crew and invest the audience in them emotionally so that when something bad happens to them, you feel something.
Yeah.
That's a very hard thing to sell on the page. That's a very hard thing to pitch to somebody.
You also have an opening where your protagonist, Ethan, is not in the scene at all.
Yes, you're talking about a big, expensive sequence.
Right.
That breaks it breaks a rule of Mission Impossible. An unwritten one, but a very important rule, which is all Mission Impossibles start on Ethan Hunt, except for Mission 2, which led you to Ethan Hunt. Although then that wasn't Ethan Hunt, it was a guy.
Right.
You remember the movie. So yes, it was just a big unknown. It was a big uncertainty for a lot of people. And when you fight for something that hard, and when you get it, that generates an enormous amount of anxiety, because there were times when we were uncertain about whether or not the submarine worked, whether or not the submarine was the right opening for the movie.
Did you have a backup plan?
We always do, and we never do. We commit to those things, and it's like we're going to make it work right up until it doesn't work. And then if there were a way to cut it out of the movie, you've seen other stuff we've cut out of the film. If it can go, it must go. That was my fear, was not that it had to go. Was I going to find an edit of the movie where it could go? And in the world in which it could be cut out of the movie, I'd have to cut it out of the movie, whether the studio was asking me to or not. I wouldn't leave it in the movie just because we spent a bunch of money on it. So I lost a lot of sleep thinking, God, am I gonna end up in a moment where I discover, shit, I never should have done this? And there were many conversations about that possibility when the running time of the movie was much longer than it is now. We confronted that. We said, look, here's the possibility. What if we took it out? What if we only used it as flashbacks in the later part of the movie? And would that work? We ultimately agreed it didn't. It became information. You didn't feel it. But if that had worked, I would have cut it out of the movie. It would have been a lot of money spent on a very, very short sequence. I also know that there's a world in which that sequence, had I cut it out of part one, that entire sequence could be employed in part two in a completely different way.
Sure.
So there's no waste. It's just, again, goes back to that big logistical thing of, hey, we're going to build this set and then sit on it for a couple of years. Look, for every dollar you spend, you got to earn 3 back.
Right.
So when people ask, oh, do you have an unlimited budget? Not only do we not have an unlimited budget, I wouldn't want an unlimited budget. God forbid I had a blank check and could just do whatever I wanted to do. You'd write yourself into oblivion. You need that pressure. You need that resistance. I don't resent the studio's reluctance, or trepidation, I should say. I don't resent their caution. I completely understand it. That's their job. That's what they're supposed to do. And it causes you to be completely honest with yourself, if you're capable of being honest with yourself. It just ended up being an enormous responsibility. Whereas if the studio had said, yeah, awesome, and pulled the trigger, at some point I could have turned and said, you guys wanted this, but I didn't have that luxury. It was all on me. It was all on me.
Well, so, okay, look, we're going to get into spoilers now. So if you have not yet seen Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, go see it. It's in theaters. Come back and listen to the rest of the episode, because we're going to jump into spoilers. You know, one of the things that's always interested me about your process is that lately, at least, you know, especially on Fallout, you have a way of using the importance of location scouts to inform action beats. And my favorite one in Fallout was when you did the tour of the Paris canals underground, and you looked up and saw the netting, and you had that great sequence where Ethan just runs at some bushes with a knife, and you're like, what's he doing? And then the boat's down there. I'm curious, what would be the equivalent of something like that on this movie? What would be something that a location, a space, and being in it as a writer-director really influenced how that portion of the movie was going to go?
Virtually every location on this movie, every set on this movie. Big examples would be, the only reason there's a desert sequence in this movie is because there was an airport in Abu Dhabi that had not yet opened. We were supposed to shoot that sequence in Germany. Germany had an airport that they had not yet opened. And it was an airport they had been building going all the way back to when Tom and I were shooting Valkyrie there. We used to fly past the construction site of that airport. It still had not opened. And because you had an empty airport, that's an amazing resource. It's a great opportunity. So we went and we scouted it. And of course, that then said, okay, well, if you're going to go to Germany to shoot this airport sequence, what else are you going to shoot in Germany? You're bringing the whole crew over. So we were scouting all of Germany too. And we were really struggling to make our story work with the assets that were available to us in and around Berlin. We were struggling to make it work. And then a miracle occurred. They reneged on the airport. They said, you can't have it anymore. We're closer to opening than we thought we were. We don't want this to slow anything down. And so suddenly our primary reason for going to Germany was gone. And with that, we decided, okay, fine. There's no airport sequence in our movie. Moving on. And Abu Dhabi then said, hey, we have an airport and it's far away from opening. You can have complete run of the airport Security won't be any kind of an issue, which it normally is when you're shooting in an airport because it's a sterile area. There are places you can't go. They were far enough away from their opening. They said you can have the complete run of the place. And it was spectacular. It's absolutely amazing, amazing space. So, of course, we then said, well, if we're going to Abu Dhabi, we should have a desert sequence in our movie since we're moving all the crew there. So that gives you an idea of there's an alternate universe in which that airport sequence took place in Berlin, and as a result, there's no desert sequence in the movie. It would be a completely different story. It would be a completely different feel. We wanted to shoot in Italy, and we went and scouted Venice and Rome and fell in love with both and decided we had action sequences that we wanted to do there. But again, we didn't know what those action sequences were until we went and scouted Rome. Now, Rome is a very particular place, very different from Paris in terms of the real estate that is actually usable. And the way we did the Arc de Triomphe in Fallout, you remember that story. We shot that whole thing in 51 minutes. They'd only give it to us for an hour.
Right.
After sunup. We had a similar thing on Via Imperiale where the car accident happens and the gunfight kicks off. We only had that location for 2 days. And the reason why there's a giant oneer in that sequence of Tom getting Haley out of the car, establishing all of that geography, doing all of that in a oneer was to eliminate coverage because I knew I could only be here for so long. And the entire sequence was designed in such a way that the big parts of it could be shot on location. But the car accident itself, we knew that would take a day in and of itself. So we designed it so that the car accident and the action leading up to it were actually shot back in the UK. And it's completely seamless. You can't tell.
No, it's wonderful. Your use of locations is always spectacular, and here was no different.
They're spectacular locations. Rome is absolutely gorgeous, but it's also very interesting in that Rome is a city that is developed over thousands of years. So the old and new Rome often run right into each other, which can be very jarring. So finding a way to shoot around new Rome so that you're only seeing old Rome determined the way a lot of the city was shot. It determined the cameras we used, the lenses we used. Tom coming out of the subway with that steering wheel handcuffed to his hand, coming out of the metro. That entire shot is so you're avoiding all of the ugly modern architecture and all you're seeing is the beauty of it. If you go to that location, you'll be stunned at what you're not seeing in the frame.
Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you to check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. You know, you could read us online on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. We're kind of on pause, but we are adding new articles when they arise, and they do. So as a digital magazine, we could do that, which is lovely, but we're on pause because of the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strike, because there's certain parameters in which we cannot interview both writers and actors. But there's certain parameters we can. The guidelines keep getting clearer each day, so we will be having some content about the strike and working conditions and pay as well. But there's plenty to read at Backstory, and if you've never read us before, you could read our free issue. You could also dig through our archive, which includes previous interviews with today's guest, Christopher McQuarrie, and we really appreciate your support over the last decade for independent film journalism, so I hope you will continue to support us at Backstory, and you could save $5 off a one-year subscription by using coupon code SAVE5. That's SAVE and the number 5, and you could use it at backstory.net in your shopping cart. I would also like to thank today's two sponsors, screencraft.org and finaldraft.com, both of whom also in our opening support the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strike as well and all their members. And so I hope you'll check out their websites to support them. Screencraft has years of experience of putting together writers with agents and managers to launch their careers and is a great resource featuring both writing lectures and genre-specific writing contests. So if you're a screenwriter, check out screencraft.org to learn more. Of course, you got to write the script first before you can enter a contest, so make sure to check out the world-renowned screenwriting software Final Draft 12. You can learn all about it over at finaldraft.com. And folks, keep in mind now through August 31st, 2023, you could save 30% off an upgrade or new download of Final Draft 12 over at finaldraft.com, where you could use discount coupon code QAPOD23. That's QAPOD23. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our interview with writer-director Christopher McQuarrie about his latest film, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning, Part 1. Because we're short on time, I really want to talk about something that is interesting in this film, in which we've had these three films with your antagonist, the man, the puppeteer himself, good old Solomon, and he's not even mentioned here. And it was interesting that there's a creation of the entity, and people are, of course, journalists that have seen the movie speculating that Solomon's somehow behind this or the apostles are, but there's barely a mention. And that was interesting, in which, knowing that you have two parts to this movie, that more can be explored behind the entity in the second part, you're also at a disadvantage, some could argue, on paper, not in the movie itself, but I could see it in pre-production, in which there's no face to your antagonist. It's the HAL 9000, but actually the entity barely utters a word in this movie, aside from copying people's voices and stuff. So what was the challenge of having an antagonist like that personified by its own disciples of Gabriel and Paris?
It's really interesting you asked that question. The entity as it is now in the movie did not exist when the movie started. We knew that information technology was the threat. We did not think of it as the villain per se. When we were in Venice, which was kind of the beginning of the movie, we kept feeling a need for, Tom really kept saying, there is somebody behind Eastside. There's something more to this story. He just kept feeling like there was something bigger, and we tried to personify it with a person. We created this shadowy character we referred to as the Phantom. And we knew that a lot of the ideas that you're seeing that are fully formed in the movie were still very nascent when we were first shooting the movie. And if you watch very carefully, you can see the Phantom in one shot. There's one shot where he remains very, very, very deep in the background.
Do you want to tell us
where? But
where?
you can quite clearly see there is this kind of mysterious silhouetted character.
Chris, do you want to tell us where?
You look for it and you'll see it. You'll
right.
definitely, knowing that you will see it. He's somewhere in Venice. But he was walking around during the foot chase. Ethan kept glimpsing him, and you felt this sense that there was somebody else involved in the story. My problem was when the guy came to set wearing a long black coat, a black hat, and his face was darkened. So
right.
He's silhouette. I just turned to Tom and I was like, "This looks like Gasserson, dude. Like, I don't know what to tell you. This is just like it's so weirdly self-referential. But at the same time, we know from our process, if you have a feeling, go with it. Just go with it. And one of two things will happen. It'll either lead to something or it'll die on the vine. There's no pride of authorship. Nobody clings to anything. And the entity slowly began to take shape. And it's hard for me to accurately recall a lot of how things evolved, only because of how they evolved and over such a dispersed period of time. We were in Venice when the pandemic broke out in pre-production and we had to leave. So we were in Venice twice. We were in Rome twice because we had to leave Rome to go back to Venice and then come back to Rome. So I kind of have lost track of a lot of how those things developed. Unlike, you and I have talked about other movies where I'm just sitting there going, oh, and then this happened and this happened and this happened. Right. So it's hard for me to recall exactly where the entity became the entity. And it probably formed as I was writing that scene with the director of national intelligence, as that came into being. And you were forced to explain what this thing was. We started to have to describe it. And I would say in trying to describe it, it became more of a presence in the story. Whether that was something Gabriel controlled or something that controlled Gabriel, we were never really settled on that when we started.
Look, for all the things that you could be nervous about, there's one thing that's really stuck with me. There's a playful tone in this movie that was interesting to see, ranging from the car chase to when they find the yellow Fiat to, that being playful and all the good stuff with the handcuffs and the steering wheel. But really, there's something that people refer to, of course, as the suspension of disbelief. And for all the things to be nervous about, the one thing I could see you debating back and forth a little before release, it literally drew applause with the crowd that I was at, was, yeah, sure, Ethan's jumping off a mountain in a motorcycle with a parachute trying to get on a train. That's a crazy, huge, risky stunt. But narratively, the risk of him just happening to come through the window of the train at the exact moment that he is needed, in the exact train car that he is needed, in this haphazard way that he's gotten there, not sure how to find her and stuff like that. It kind of adds a little bit of that just kismet of the luck of Ethan Hunt as our adventuring hero. And, he promised her that he would be there when she needs him, and he was. Tell us about that moment, because it really drew applause from the crowd. in an alternate universe, it could have tanked. People could have been like, what? That's silly.
Yes, it could have. And I can tell you there are times when it did. We tested this movie several times. We had friends and family screenings. We cut that moment many times. It is such a carefully constructed and surgical suspension of disbelief. But it's also what makes it work, I believe, is what he went through to get there, what he was willing to do to get there. If the motorcycle jump didn't work, then the smashing through the window wouldn't work.
Sure.
If you reach a point in the story where the character needs to be there, you tend not to care how they get there. It's just you're giving them what they want when they want it. And the rest comes down to Tom Cruise's performance and how he plays that moment. The kind of stunned and slightly dazed way that Tom is playing that entire moment is really what sells it.
It was played for a laugh almost because he has this sense of surprise, and then he's immediately, well, of course this is what I meant to do, and people were cheering when I saw it. I mean, it was fantastic.
Look, you want it. You want it, and the wanting it is in the setup of the story. In earlier cuts of the film, Grace ends up on the train in a very different way. And the setup to the train sequence is different. And so Ethan's trying to get to the train is different. The editing, the structure of that sequence was different. The reason that your third act works is because your first and second act work. The gag, all by itself, it wouldn't work. It's a testament to how invested those people are in those characters, and how invested they are has as much to do with the structure as it does to do with the two people playing those characters.
Here's the last question. So what was your Mission Impossible? It's a cheesy setup to a question, but seriously, this is your multiple foray into this franchise. You had a lot of resources. What was the scene that stumped you? What was the scene as a director that you found yourself, all the planning in the world didn't help?
I walked into our first day on stage, having finished shooting all of our locations. We came back to England, and it came time to shoot the train sequence, which, as big as the submarine thing was, the train was bigger. We had built a 70-ton locomotive. We built the entire Orient Express that we knew we were going to throw off a cliff, and we didn't have a cliff to throw it off of. I was so out on a limb on that sequence, and I did not know anything that was happening inside the train and couldn't figure it out because it's a tube. You had all the characters had to be moving through a tube and not seeing each other, missing one another. It was an extremely difficult set to work in, and I brought all the actors together, and it was a scene right out of Murder on the Orient Express. I was in the room with all of my cast, and I said to them, I do not know how this sequence ends. I know it ends in this car. That's all I know. I knew in my bones the movie ended in that red car, or the sequence ended in that red car, and that's all I knew. That and the airport were, for Eric Jenderson and I, two of the biggest, most complicated, hairy, difficult puzzles to work out, and they were sequences that we were struggling with right up until the very end. They were punishing to sort out.
Well, look, amigo, you figured it out. I love the movie. Everybody's going to be really excited for part 2, which I know.
I'm so relieved, dude. I can't tell you. I say thank you, but I also say thank God. I'm just so freaking relieved that this movie makes sense to anybody.
It makes complete sense. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to us reconvening and continuing the conversation.
Thanks.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to writer-director Christopher McQuarrie for being so generous with his time and chatting about his latest film, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. And folks, I also want to thank today's sponsors, and I hope you go check them out. Screencraft has a ton of great resources and genre-specific contests you can find over at screencraft.org. And Final Draft is the industry's leading screenwriting software, and you can learn all about Final Draft 12 over at finaldraft.com. And folks, keep in mind now through August 31st, 2023, you could save 30% off an upgrade or new download of Final Draft 12 over at finaldraft.com, where you could use discount coupon code QAPOD23. That's QAPOD23. And folks, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that I also hope you will check out Backstory Magazine over at backstory.net. Issue 50 is a bit delayed due to the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strike. And of course, we support all the members of the WGA and SAG-AFTRA strike and will follow all guidelines about when they can and cannot be interviewed and what they could be interviewed about. So we will be having new content appear in the magazine, and it's being updated into issue 49, which looks a little silly because it's our Oscar issue, but our May issue that was going to come out with Emmy stuff, and it was delayed the minute the strike began. So aside from reading our current issue, you could also look through our archive, which contains previous Christopher McQuarrie interviews and a lot of great content and scripts to read as well. So I hope you look through our content. If you've never read us before, you could read a free issue of Backstory Magazine on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. So I hope you check that as well. And if you would like to subscribe to us, you could subscribe at backstory.net, which will also give you iPad access if you have an iPad. And it helps us a little more than if you subscribed at Apple. So please do it that way. You could go to backstory.net, and if you want to subscribe, I will give you a discount coupon code of SAVE5, that's SAVE and the number 5, and that will give you $5 off a 1-year subscription to Backstory Magazine. So look, your support over the last decade of independent film journalism by subscribing and reading Backstory Magazine has meant the world to me. So thanks again for your support. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2023. All rights reserved. And folks, if you want to reach out to me, you could email me anytime at backstoryletters@gmail.com, which I go through. You could find me on Twitter as Yo Goldsmith or backstory_mag. You could find me on Instagram as Yo Goldsmith or backstory_mag. There's so many ways to reach me. I occasionally respond to messages on my Facebook fan page. Don't check Facebook as often, trying to get better about that. But look, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.